A very good evening to everyone and a warm welcome to our BWM talk series. I am Lim Wei Ling, the president of Badan Warisan, Malaysia. It is my pleasure and a great honor to introduce Rose Gan, the author of Dragon, the first in the Penang Chronicles trilogy, published worldwide on November the 1st, 2021, just 2 days ago. The chronicles follow the life and times of Captain Francis Light, a country trader for the East India Company who established the first British settlement in the Straits of Malacca on the island of Penang in 1786. Rose is British and married to a Malaysian, and her family lives in Southeast Asia. She's a historian who has taught the United Kingdom and Malaysia, and more recently, she has worked with museums both in Indonesia and Malaysia as a docent, trainer, lecturer, editor, and writer. Rose has been an active member of various cultural societies, including the Indonesian Heritage Society, the Malaysia Culture Group, and the Museum Volunteers of Malaysia. The Penang Chronicles trilogy has taken 15 years in the creation and has already received much praise from notable authors in the region. Today's talk will be moderated by Zoe Gan Rankin, Rose's daughter. Zoe was born in Malaysia and raised in the United Kingdom, and she now lives in Kuala Lumpur with her husband and her sons. A very warm welcome, ladies. Let's kick things off with this very special video that we're going to play now for you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Zoe Gan Rankin, and I'm really pleased to be here with you all today. I'm the moderator, and I will not be saying very much at all, just a little introduction now, and then a little bit more later at the end when we're answering questions and answers. So to start off with, I would like to tell you about what you can expect today in this next hour or so. Rose will begin with a 45-minute-ish PowerPoint presentation and in more of a kind of conversation lecture that will follow the life and times of Francis Light. And then after that, we will get an opportunity for Rose to answer some of our questions. I say ours is because I'm asking them, and I will be asking your questions. And if you're wondering how you ask those questions, what I would be really grateful for is at any point in Rose's presentation for you to drop them into the Q&A box. You will see that there's a Q&A box and a chat box. We would hope that you could drop them in the Q&A box because that will let other participants see what the questions are, and other participants can vote or like the question that they like the best. The one with the most votes will go to the top of the list, and that will probably be the one that I pick first. I will also monitor the chat, so if you accidentally put a question in the chat that is aimed at Rose, then I will also try to look at that too. And if that is very similar to a question that's in the Q&A, I'll make sure that it's covered in that too. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Rose Gan to talk us through her presentation, but I really want to remind you, and I will drop messages in the chat to remind you to think about your questions and pop them in the Q&A box at any point through the presentation. So over to you, Rose, take it away. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's absolutely wonderful to be here this evening. Can I just ask perhaps to go back to the previous slide? Thank you. Thank you to Badan Warisan most particularly, to Wei Ling, to Vanessa, Amira, and all those behind the scenes who've made it possible, and for the wonderful work that they do for Malaysian history and heritage. I am going to talk about Francis Light tonight, of course I am, But my focus particularly, and that of my series of novels, is also on the people of the Straits themselves. Francis Light, for me, is a sort of conduit into the world of Straits in the late 18th century, and it's a fascinating period, and one that has contributed so much to the world that we're in today in this part of the world. I'm going to start by being a bit controversial. I'm going to ask the question that some people perhaps want to ask of me. Why have we got to have another book about a white colonial hero? So if we could change the slide now we can look at the more controversial slide about this happened actually last year to the Light statue at Fort Cornwallis. Somebody threw red paint over it, an act of vandalism, a sort of act that's been replicated all over the world. We've seen these examples in Europe and America at the same time. And the phrase cancel culture was being bandied around. And I had to give that some thought. And in some ways, I totally understand where it's coming from. There are many, many statues around the world, people who perhaps are guilty of all sorts of appalling acts, both as colonialists and slavers and so on. And personally, I have absolutely no problem with those statues being taken down. But the other things that were being thrown around, like cancel culture, stop looking at the past. We shouldn't give airtime to long dead colonial rulers. We should put the past behind us. History isn't relevant. All these things bring me as a historian some concern, because of course, everything we are today is only the way it is, the challenges of our life all around the world because of our past. To actually try to put it in a box and close the lid is not going to solve any of the challenges that we have in the present. So my answer to cancel culture is, let's find out more about the past. Let's find out in the right way, though. We don't want to hear the British version of what happened in Malaysia anymore. Malaysians should be telling their own story. And this is the story of Malaysia as much as it is the story of the colonial past. So I'm going to start my talk by going back to the 18th century, and I'm going to start it in the Straits. So if we could have the next slide, please. So the late 18th century, this is the world that Francis Light entered. We're back now about 1765, something like that, when he first came to India, when he first went to Madras. What was going on in the Straits at the time? Well, it was a time of what I might say, it was an existential crisis in the Straits. There'd always been a lot of stormy times for the Straits, of course, but a sort of uneasy symbiosis had been maintained for a very long time. But things were reaching a head around the mid-1760s. In the north, there was the clash of the empires, the great empires of Burma and Siam. They were always fighting each other. They were inveterate enemies. But the clash that they fought in the mid-1760s led to the destruction of Ayutthaya, the capital of Siam. Now, that is something that is often not really mentioned outside of this part of the world, but it was a cataclysmic event. Siam was in shatters. Now, how was the Straits viewing that? Well, partly they were very concerned because many of the states of the Straits were actually vassal states of Siam. So if Burma completely marched into Siam, would they be next? Would they be facing the Burmese and become part of the Burmese Empire eventually? But on the other hand, if Siam was in chaos and Burma didn't come any further south, perhaps they would be independent. So there was quite a lot of unsureness about what was actually going to happen there. Down in the south of the peninsula, however, there was a much more serious, real problem growing. And that was, of course, the problem of the Bugis. Down in the Riau Archipelago, just south of the Malaysian peninsula, the Bugis, who had come from Sulawesi as traders, or some might say raiders, had now built for themselves a real stronghold in the Riau Archipelago, particularly around the island of Bintan, where there was a huge emporium which was sucking the trade away from Malacca, from Dutch Malacca. In fact, they were specializing in many of the goods that Malacca, the Dutch had a monopoly in. So they were of great concern to not only the Dutch, but also all the the sultans of the peninsula. In fact, I would hazard a guess that if somebody asked in 1770 who's going to do the most damage to the Straits, it wouldn't have been the British for sure. It might not have even been the Dutch. It probably would have been the Bugis. So we've got to get into that sort of mindset when we look back at this period. But of course, there was also the Europeans, the Dutch, who were very well hated in the Straits. Their port was one that monopolized trade and had very high taxes and levies. But there was also Britain and France operating around. In fact, sometimes the European rivalries of places far away were actually played out in the Straits. So by another 10 years' time, there will actually be a war fought in this area, which is actually between Britain and France. So there's a lot going on at this period, and this is the world that Francis Light is going to walk into. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Thank you. Francis Light then was born in Woodbridge, Suffolk. He was an illegitimate boy. Now, very little is actually known about his origins. Some people say that he was raised by his parents, who were Mary Light and William Negus, who'd been in some illicit relationship, but that isn't by any means definitely for sure. What we do know is that Mary Light gave him his name, and William Negus was his guardian, and gave him a very, very good upbringing. He was brought up as a gentleman, and he went to a fine school in Woodbridge, Seckford's Free School, which you can see on the picture there. We even have some evidence that Francis was really there, because there was a piece of graffiti that he left on a window pane on one of the school windows. If you look carefully there, you will see his name at the bottom, F. Light. And I believe that's now in the property of Penang Museum. My book has a theory about what happened with that. But the problem for Francis was whether or not he was born a gentleman, raised a gentleman. He wasn't born a gentleman. And in the late 18th century, your prospects were severely curtailed if you didn't have a name. Can we have the next slide, please? At the age of 14, he decided to join the Royal Navy, and immediately hit the problem of his illegitimacy. Because if you were illegitimate and you didn't have a name or a father of note, your chances of promotion in any walk of life were very, very slim, no matter what your ability was. So Francis tries to get into the Navy as a midshipman. That's what the title of the slide is, Midshipman Light, which is the lowest rank of officer in the Royal Navy, but he doesn't secure that position. The picture here is not Francis Light. It's a boy very much like him who joined the Navy at the age of 14, and he was a midshipman. But Light didn't even get that role. He, in fact, instead was a surgeon's assistant, a very difficult job for a young boy to do, because he'd be in the orlop dealing with all the injuries and the diseases. And so he really started at the bottom. But he had the dubious good fortune of being in the Navy at a time of war. Just as he joined, the 7 Years' War broke out. Now, the 7 Years' War, and here's a fun fact for you, it's actually the world's first global war. And it was the first of very many. It was fought between the French and the British, and it took place in many theatres around the world. So over the next 7 years, Francis was in the Americas for some time, and he was also in the Mediterranean. But he managed to start rising through the ranks. In time of war, there are many more ships in commission, and of course, inevitably, because of the death toll, many more officers are needed. So little bit by little bit, he began to climb the ladder. First of all, he did become a midshipman, and then he eventually became a lieutenant. He passed his lieutenant exams whilst he was on a ship, similar to the one featured there, called the Arrogant, a 76-gun ship of the line. And on that ship, he met a Scottish lad who also passed his lieutenant's exams at the same time. And that lad was called James Scott. So they were going to be bosom friends for the rest of their lives, as we know. However, the problem was wars come to the end eventually. So in 1763, when the 7 Years' War ended, suddenly his position becomes vulnerable again. officers of the lower order, like Francis, are surplus to requirements. They don't need as many ships. In fact, I think a third of the fleet was decommissioned at this time. So many men are discharged, and Francis and James Scott were amongst them. What were they to do now? They were young men in their 20s, very highly trained, master mariners, could actually have their own ship, but hadn't got a chance of getting back into the Navy almost indefinitely. Can I have the next slide, please? So Francis does exactly what many, many other young men did at the time. He went east. First, James Scott went. He got a job with the East India Company. He was fortunate because he had an uncle who was an East India captain, and he arranged it for him. Light must have also tried to go in that way, but he doesn't secure a position with the East India Company. Again, we suspect it's his illegitimacy. Who is his father? He's nobody. We don't want officers like this. We don't know who he is. So despite his skills as a captain and his education, he has to find his own route to the east, and he takes passage, he works his passage, in fact, on an East Indiaman, one of these big cargo ships that went out to Madras and Calcutta, and eventually finds himself a job working for an agency in Madras, a country agency. Now, country agencies ran the country ships, which were the regional ships that ran the cargoes out through the Andaman area, from Phuket, Kedah, Sumatra, maybe even down to the Maldives and back and forth to Madras, because the big East Indiamen couldn't negotiate all the tiny little local ports. It was a very tough life to be a country ship captain, but Light seems to take to it very well. Think about it, you know, you're a British captain, but you're in a crew of local men, from all different areas of the East, all different cultures, all different languages, but everybody speaks Malay. That's the lingua franca. So he learns Malay very quickly. But then there's many other challenges to him. First of all, he's got to learn the routes. He's got to learn the business of trade and the commodities, and not be tricked and fooled. He's going in and out of ports which could be quite dodgy or dangerous, you know. But then there's the problems like literally the storms at sea and pirates and catching tropical diseases. So it takes a strong man to survive in that world, and survive he does. Francis and James Scott both make a very successful living over the next 5 years or so, building up a wide network of regional contacts. And the very interesting thing, particularly about Light, but about Scott too, is that in areas where the British don't normally become accepted very easily, Light and Scott are accepted very easily. They're well liked, they live with the locals, they're very well integrated, but they also get to know all the movers and shakers of the day, all the important traders, all the sultans, and become quite close contacts of them. And this is going to stand Light in very good stead. A call goes out at this time from the East India Company. They really feel that they really need a forward base somewhere in the East Indies. To take their East India men all the way from Calcutta to China, which is where their main interest is in trade, means they're going through lots and lots of waters in which they have no base, and they're all hostile waters, and they really feel the need of somewhere that they can both use for repair and revictualling, but also just to keep troops, so in case they have any trouble. So this call goes out. If any of our people can find someone from Calcutta to Canton who could secure us a base, and Light thinks, I'm your man. And so that becomes his obsession for the next 15 years or so of his life. Can we have the next slide, please? The first of his contacts that strikes him as being a potential for this new British base is amongst the Bugis of Riau. Now, Light has actually very close relationships with the Bugis, and that's a very unusual group to get in with, because they don't really usually deal with Europeans. They absolutely hate the Dutch, which might be in his favor that he's British, because the British also pretty much hate the Dutch too. But he suggests Bintan in the Riau archipelago to the British as a potential British base. And he seems to have the approval of the King of Riau, who is Dayang Kamboja. Now, he's a very interesting character, and there's many members of his family very significant people in the day. And he doesn't normally take to Europeans at all. Don't forget at this time that the Bugis are not just in Riau, they're also very much in Johor. Dayan Kamboja was the Yamchuan Muda of Johor, the real power behind the Johor throne. So they've got they're really controlling that southern straits. And Light very, very accurately realizes, in fact, he's a Raffles before Raffles, if you like, because he accurately realizes that it's that entrance to the straits which is the real place you want to be. So with this Johor Riau base, that would really give the British a preeminence against the Dutch. Of course, there's another plus for the Bugis as well. In 1766, Rajah Lumu, who is a nephew of the King of Riau, it becomes the first Sultan of Selangor. So the Bugis are working their way up the straits here, and he knows to be in with the Bugis gives him an awful lot of power at the time. But the British, there's no way they're going to work with the Bugis. They completely squash the idea. They regard the Bugis as buccaneers and they ought to be taken out and hung from yardarms. They will not deal with the Bugis. And they particularly won't challenge the Dutch yet. They don't feel ready to challenge the Dutch, because if they did support the Bugis, who were the mortal enemies of the Dutch and who were regularly going to war against them, that would implicate them in those wars. And the British will never get involved with local warfare. So the Bugis, X, that's one is not counted. So Light moves on. Can we have the next slide? A few years, the next slide, please, thank you. A few years later, we find him living in Aceh. He's living in what was then called Kutaraja, but is now, of course, Banda Aceh. And he's well known to the Sultan of Aceh, Sultan Alauddin, who, and the British have recognized this, is really in quite dire straits at the times. For a start, he's massively threatened by Dutch ambitions. The Dutch are working their way up the straits, up Sumatra, and some of his lands have already fallen under their control. But he has a second problem, and that's from his own nobles. His nobles have increasingly begun to decentralize and form their own little power groups and are controlling most of the trade. So he's living in great luxury in Kutaraja, but with very little power of his own. And he's very, very keen to try and reclaim Aceh for himself. So at that time, he was very open to Europeans. And you find a lot of Europeans coming to Aceh to trade, as well as the British, the French, the Danish, the Swedish. But it's the British he seems to favour most because he seems to like Francis Light. But Light is shrewd enough to realise that although they have a factory, which is like a trading post, they will never secure a port there. This is an Islamic state of a very ancient line, and they will never really give territory away to the Christian Europeans. It's just not going to happen. And they would also, that would be very unpopular amongst their all the Arab and Indian Muslim traders were there. So he himself, although the East India Company are very keen on Aceh, he doesn't think that's the place to go. However, whilst he's in Aceh, a golden opportunity falls on his lap. The Sultan of Kedah sends an ambassador to make a pitch to him for something that might mean a British base is possible. And the ambassador is a woman, or so the story goes. Well, read more about that in my book. We can change the slide. And that Sultan of Kedah is called Muhammad Jiwa, who is a fascinating character who I could give a whole lecture on. He's a very old man by now, could have been on the throne for over 50 years by the time this ambassador arrives to Light. And Light already knows him. He's been in and out of Kedah trading and has been at the court before. And that's why Muhammad Jiwa reaches out to him, because Muhammad Jiwa knows that of all the British, he's the one that would be best able to represent Kedah interests as well as their own. But Light is shrewd, and he knows that Muhammad Jiwa is in a lot of trouble in 17, we're now about 1770 when he's at court. And to summarize it very quickly, he has recently, the Sultan has recently been ousted from his throne by a coalition of his own family, one of his brothers, and the Bugis. They've gone into alliance together. And of course, the Bugis would love to move to more power in the northern peninsula. Al-Star has been raided. All the ports have been raided. Massive amount of cargo has been stolen. But even worse, the palace at Al-Star has been burnt down, and Muhammad himself has had to flee, and he's now in Kanga, which at that time, of course, Perlis was still the northern province of Kuala, so that is still part of his kingdom, and he's in desperate straits to get back his throne. And Light knows this. Light knows he's very vulnerable at the moment, and he's also offering this golden opportunity. And this golden opportunity is, I will give the British a base around the Kuala area, by the sea estuary, and in return, you will help me get my throne back. You'll provide the aid. There's a few pictures there that you've probably noticed, like the Bunga Mas. Muhammad has been sending the Bunga Mas every 5 years to Siam because he is a vassal of Siam. But interestingly enough, and this is just a point to sort of show what a wily operator Muhammad was, he has recently sent the Bunga Mas also to Burma just in case. He is an inveterate politician. He is a wily campaigner. And even if Light thinks he can exploit him, Muhammad is not a man to be easily exploited. So Light makes this proposal to the East India Company. But the East India Company say, who is this Light? Please, can we go back to that last slide? Can we go back a slide? Thank you. He says, the East India Company saying, who is this this chap? He's nobody. We can't let him handle important negotiations. So in fact, he is pushed aside by a delegation that arrived from Madras, led by a young Anglo-Irish nobleman called Edward Monckton, who is probably the worst person for the job. He is young, he's arrogant, he's ignorant, he's brash. Even Sultan Muhammad Jiwa is horrified. He says to Scott, "Did the British have no one better than a stuttering boy?" Or rather, of course, he said that in Malay, but I mean, that's my British translation of it. And this young man just rides with hobnail boots over the whole negotiation. He offends the Malay court and protocol, and inevitably the negotiations grind to a halt, and the Sultan and the East India Company cannot find terms in which they can agree. But even worse than that, the East India Company blame Light completely for this. They say, it's you made false representation to us, and you made false representation to the Sultan, and your incompetence has caused it. And he's furious because, of course, he was the only one who really could have brought them all together. At that point, he absolutely loses patience with the East India Company. He breaks completely with them, and he joins James Scott, who is based in Phuket, and he decides he's just going to spend the rest of his life as a private trader. But before that happens, at the same time as in Kuala, he makes an interesting relationship. And if we can now have the next slide. Thank you. He meets and makes a relationship with Martina Rozelles, and I'm calling her very enigmatic because almost everything about Martina Rozelles is a question mark. She is said to be a princess from Kuala, a Malay princess of Kuala, or some people say she's a Nyonya lady from Kuala. Maybe she was the lady who went on that embassy to Aceh. Others say, oh no, she's a Eurasian from Phuket. You can tell her name, it's Portuguese. She's a Catholic. Nobody knows where Light met her. Did he meet her in Aceh? Did he meet her in Kuala? Did he actually not meet her maybe till he got to Phuket after the negotiations failed? Were they married? Some say they married under Muslim rights in Kuala. Some say they married under Catholic rights in Phuket. But Light in his will refers to her as his life partner. Who knows? It's a complete mystery. Unfortunately, this is often the case. Historians find that the woman's record is missing completely from history. But even if we don't know anything for sure about Martina, we actually do know that she was a very, very significant person in Light's life. She was with him for 23 years. She gave him 5 children who all went on to have very significant careers in the British establishment. So obviously their background didn't seem to hold them back. And I think we can see her hand behind some of the decisions that Light makes in later life. Now, I am not saying any more about that because they feature in my book, of course, where I think we can see her hand. There's 2 beautiful pictures on the screen that I know you can see, and both at different times have been attributed to be Martina, but I personally, I don't think any of them are, but they do come from the right period, and they were both painted probably in Calcutta, and the time is right. One of them, she looks more like a Nyonya lady. It's got more of a Chinese aesthetic. The one on the right, of course, would perhaps be more of an Islamic look. She's wearing a turban and so on. And I've only put them there because it would be lovely if we could actually have a picture of her, but we can't. But she's very, very central to the story, and she's certainly very central to my book. So off Light goes with his new partner, Martina Roselles, to Phuket. So if you can change the slide now. Thank you. So Phuket in 1772 is a very volatile place. By the way, I've been calling it Phuket all the way through because that's what it's known as now. Of course, it wasn't known as Phuket then. It was actually more commonly known by everyone as Ujang Salang, which is Malay, of course. And the Siamese refer to it as Talang, which is actually a corruption of Ujang Salang. And the British called it Junk Silan or Yon Silan or something like that, which is again a corruption of Ujang Salang. And the reason why Malay features so highly in its name, and of course Phuket itself comes from the Malay word bukit, is because Phuket, although it was nominally Siamese, part of the Siamese Empire, it was in fact a very cosmopolitan port and a very high Malay population. And it's almost meaningless to say whether it was Malay or Siamese because at different times it was ruled by different parties. In fact, you can see by the box on the left that in this period it had swung backwards and forwards. As soon as Ayutthaya was destroyed, Sultan Muhammad Jiwa took over and there was a Malay governor. As soon as the Bugis drove him off his throne, the Bugis took over and put in a Bugis governor. As soon as Siam reasserted itself under Thaksin, the Siamese put in a governor. And later in this period, 1785, the Burmese arrived. So it is a very volatile period. But Light and Scott do really, really well in Phuket. They're actually there for 15 years, and that's the bulk of Light's experience. And in fact, you get to know as much about Light as a historian by looking at Phuket records as you do about Malaysian. And there's a lot of information in Phuket that's of great interest. But one thing is very clear, he's very friendly with this very, very important lady of Phuket, who's called Lady Chan. I'll say a little bit more about her later. But together with Lady Chan and her Lady Chan's husband, who's the governor, and Light himself and Scott, they make a proposal to the East India Company that Phuket should be the ideal location for British base. And Warren Hastings, the Governor General, is interested because he sees the value of Phuket. The only problem is its volatility. And that makes them hold back a bit. Is it going to be safe? Is there going to be more war there? Is Burma going to be a problem? Can we have the next slide, please? Whilst he's in Phuket, Light becomes a very close associate of King Thaksin, the formidable young general who reunites Siam, reconquers Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, and lots of other territories for Siam in only a matter of years. Light visits Thonburi as a guest several times. He's very well treated there because he's supplying weapons. He's the main arms dealer, if you like, for the period. He's helping Thaksin fight his Burmese war and all these other wars as well. So much so that Thaksin gives him a noble title, ennobles him, and calls him Chao Phraya Raja Kapitan Bang Ken, which is a very high title indeed. So here's another incident of an important ruler of the Straits who's taken by Light. He has to have some qualities for all these very shrewd rulers to feel that he is a man they can work with. He also offers Light a potential alternative base, and that's Mergui, which I believe now is called Maykay. It's an archipelago and a port, which is now in southern Burma, and it was Burmese at this time, but Thaksin is sure that he's going to take this very southerly port back and archipelago back, and he thinks that would be a good base for the British. The British are somewhat hesitant with that because, of course, that would bring them very close to Burma, but it's yet another proposal that Light makes at this period. So what's been going on back in Calcutta? Can I have the next slide now? So war's broken out again. Can we just, sorry, you've jumped a bit. The war has broken out, and Light is almost within, grasping distance of his aim when Warren Hastings, the Governor General, the shrewd and competent man, says, I would be ready to move, except I cannot afford to move now because war is broken out. And this was a very dangerous war because France had gone into alliance with 3 Indian states, different kings of India, rulers of India, and therefore the East India Company was fighting a land war as well as a war at sea. Now we have Admiral Suffren, the French general, and one of the pictures of the famous Battle of Cuddalore. This was a very serious time for the British. They very, very, very near to losing India at this point. And the treasury of the East India Company is paying for it. And the directors back home are not happy. And Warren Hastings is struggling to keep them on side as well as fight this war. He's too overstretched at the time. There is no way he can move on a new settlement in the Straits. Not to be outdone, Light thinks, well, at least we can make some money out of the war. So he spends the war not gun running, but food running, actually. Madras was completely blockaded by French ships, and they were trying to starve Madras out. And had Madras fallen, the war may very well have gone the French way. So Light and some of his ships were running rice and other food goods into Madras and saved them, really. But in 1783, he was captured. So there's a whole area of his story, which is very exciting, when he was captured by the French. At the same time as he was captured by the French, James Scott was captured by the Dutch, because Holland had actually gone in on this war on the side of the French. They didn't fight the war, but they supplied the French with food. And obviously that made Malacca waters now were not open to the British, and Scott was captured in Malacca waters. He actually had been gun running, and the Dutch knew he was gun running because what he had been doing was selling guns to the Bugis. But luckily for him, there were no guns on board when he was taken. But he was still thrown in a Malacca jail, and it cost 2,000 Spanish dollars, I think, which is huge for his. He had to pay as a fine to be released. So 1783 to 4 was a very colourful time for both Light and Scott. Okay, can we change the slide? Thank you. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, things are looking very grim in Phuket. And remember, at the moment, Phuket is the biggest contender for the British base. I'm going back to this Lady Chan, who we mentioned before. She was the main power broker, which is hard to believe, but she was, as a woman, the main power broker in Phuket. She was a very close friend and ally of both Light and Scott. She wrote letters to Light, which we have, and it's quite clear they're more than just business acquaintances, they are friends. And Light helps her when she really needs it. She's the most influential merchant. Her family are the leading family, but more than that, she's the daughter, wife, and future mother of governors. And in 1785, the Burmese go to war again with the Siamese. This is when Thaksin is now dead, and there is a new king, King Rama, the first king of the Chakri family, who still rule in Thailand today. The Burmese army, it's called the Nine Armies War. The Burmese attacked with 9 different armies. They just simply attacked every single part of Siam, over the mountains, from the sea, from the land, everything. And this time they wanted Phuket, they wanted to close off this trading center and get hold of it for themselves. And in the end, Lady Chan is left having to defend the island. She's such a resourceful woman, because her and her sister are actually accredited with having saved Phuket from the Burmese. They hold a siege in a fort with just women and children, basically, and a few old men, and a lot of weapons that Light had dropped off for them. And as a result, the Burmese withdrew, and they did save Phuket. But Phuket is now in ruins, and it's very, very unlikely that it would be a good place to take the base, particularly with the swirling political situation there. Lady Chan goes on, actually, she seems to rise from the ashes like phoenix from everything, because after that, as a thank you to her and her sister, they both get noble titles, but also her daughter marries King Rama I and goes on to have a royal son. So, I mean, really, she is now very, very well placed. But even so, Phuket is not really the place that the British feel happy with having a base at. But something else has come up. And in the time that the war, this war was going on, Light and Scott had now returned to Kuala. They did run supplies to Phuket, but they weren't living there anymore. So we can change the slide. They're now back in Kuala. Yes, and there is a new sultan. Eventually, old Muhammad Jiwa passed away, and his son, Sultan Abdullah, took over. He was not his father's son in the sense of being able to follow him in the same way. He was a very weak and easily influenced young man, struggling really against a lot of hostility at court. And he'd chosen as his main advisor, very unwisely, a Chulia merchant called Jamual. He didn't listen to his Bendahara, he didn't listen to his Laksamana, he listened to Jamual, and that was really increasing his unpopularity at court. People were absolutely furious that he was rejecting the normal protocols of the court. And he was literally facing rebellion, and it was very likely he would be thrown off his throne. So whilst Light and Scott are in Kuala, Sultan Abdullah, who knows Light very well because he assisted his father, offers Light a deal. And he says, if you safeguard my throne, I will give the British the island of Penang, and you can have your base there. Now, Scott actually had first come up with the idea of Penang, and he'd been mulling this idea over for many years, and he'd written to the East India Company many times about it. Light had always thought, well, Penang's just an uninhabited island, and it costs so much to set up, and so on and so forth. But now that Phuket was gone, this seemed to Light a very, very viable proposition. The only problem was Sultan Abdullah was asking a phenomenal amount of money, 30,000 Spanish dollars a year rent, which was never going to fly with the British, and military support to ensure that he kept his throne. Well, the East India Company and Light well knew would never, ever, ever get involved with local conflicts, and they certainly wouldn't offer their soldiers to fight off a rebellion. But notwithstanding, Light seems to think he could fudge this in some way. You can see on the screen one of the many letters that went between Light and Abdullah. It seems like Light could actually read Jawi, or even if he couldn't read it, he had people around him who could, because lots of letters were exchanged in this period between Light and Sultan Abdullah. Eventually, they come up with a treaty proposal, and Abdullah asks Light to be his wakil, his ambassador to the East India Company, and he takes this proposal, but it's written in Jawi, and Light has it translated, or does the translation, and what actually reaches the East India Company is not quite what was on paper in the original document. If we can change the slide, thank you. Light goes to Calcutta in 1886 to find that Warren Hastings is no longer there. The cost of the war had been too phenomenal, even though they'd won it. And instead of Hastings being regarded as a hero, he was sacked, and he was sent back to London, where he was subsequently put on trial for corruption, which seems very strange because he spent most of his career trying to stop corruption. But in 1886, Light found that there was a new acting Governor General, and his name was John Macpherson. And he was a man of not great distinction who was trying to make a name for himself. So he jumped at the proposal. He thought, I could be the person who actually won a British settlement in the Straits of Malacca. So without really investigating this perhaps as close as he should, and listening to Light's version of the details, he agrees to finance the negotiations. He sends 3 ships, 2 of which actually belong to Light, a small quantity of men and arms, and a relatively small amount of money, including this hoard of very, very small coins called paisa coins. And Light is going to take that back to the Sultan. Can you have the next slide, please? Now, when Light gets back, he finds the situation has come to boiling point, because not only is everyone hating on Sultan Abdullah, but now they've got wind of the fact that Penang's going to be ceded. So there's a very, very disgruntled situation in Kuala, and there's a very real chance of civil war. And Light still hasn't got anything on paper. He spends the few weeks of late July, early August, shunting back and forth between the Sultan and his ship. And eventually a treaty is drawn up, but there is no mention of, there is, it does mention the 30,000 still on the table, which the British don't know anything about, and the military support. And he knows that this particular treaty is not going to be acceptable in Calcutta. But he does believe that if he can get Calcutta to agree to anything, that once they're established in Penang, what will Sultan Abdullah be able to do about it? Because in Light's mind, I guess, he's thinking, well, if we are there, nobody else is going to attack the Kedah. You know, I mean, the Siamese will leave us alone if the British are there. The Bugis will leave us alone if the British are there. And, you know, we'll negotiate something about the money later. Basically, I think he's very much hedging his bets. Although you may choose to say that he's actually being duplicitous. And I think he is actually being duplicitous. But that's the situation it is. But one thing begins to encourage him in just acting without permission. He sends off the treaty to Calcutta, very unsure whether it will be accepted. But he starts to receive delegations from Kedah itself. First of all, he receives a delegation of from the Chinese community, and Captain Ko, the Captain China, comes and says, if civil war breaks out, we'll be the first to be killed. They're going to ransack our businesses. We want to go to the island and live there. Will you give us permission? We'll clear the ground. We'll help you in every way. So he gives them permission to go. Then along comes a delegation of Eurasians led by some priests, and they say, we're Christians. We'll be targets if civil war breaks out. We need to go to the island, and so on and so forth. So one after another, all these different communities start to come to light, and he gives them permission to go to the island. The British are not there yet, but these people are, and they start to clear the ground already. He's almost at a point of Rubicon. Can he come back from this point? Even Jamual, the advisor, comes and says, I'll be dead if there's a civil war. I can guarantee you the Chulias will come over and that they'll bring the market there. So he's got all this kind of local background. He's even got local fishermen who are from the fishing communities on Penang, most of whom are Minangs and know they are not liked by the Kedah Malays. They are very willing to help him. So there's already a lot of people on the island beginning work and laying the foundations. So he, just at that point, 3 ships arrive from Madras. They are not bringing any kind of acceptance. They've hardly had time. It would take weeks and weeks for letters to arrive back from Calcutta. But they are dropping by because they've heard about this, and they're East Indiamen who are on their way to China. And they think, well, let's have a look at this place and see, so can we walk back? Is it going to be a good site? So when they're in port, Light seems to just simply say, right, the die is cast, I'm going to go ahead. So on the August the 15th, he tells them that he has got the go-ahead to land on the island, and tells that to the Sultan as well. He's received letters. Nobody knows what were in the letters. They obviously can pretend they were actually concerning the treaty. And the flag-raising ceremony, as we all know, the famous picture of the flag-raising ceremony, in front of all these British witnesses off these other ships. And it's a fait accompli. It's done. Because he didn't think he had much option, because if he delayed much longer, maybe there would be a civil war and they would all be murdered anyway. At least now they were on the island and they could build fortifications and see how it went. The island was called the Prince of Wales Island, as we know, after George the Prince of Wales, the main settlement, Georgetown, and the Fort Cornwallis, after the new Governor General, the acting Governor General, now been replaced by the new Governor General of India. So what happened next? If we can have the next slide, please. So Calcutta kind of just accepted it. I mean, they still didn't, there was no money changing hands, and they obviously weren't sending any military aid, but there he was on the island. His settlement was growing, and it was a fait accompli. And all reports were saying it was a great landing place. All the ships going there were liking it. So Calcutta just kind of let it go by default. Abdullah, however, did not feel quite the same. No money came his way, no armies were provided. And Light sent many letters backwards and forwards, and it was quite clear that Light was just simply not going to deliver on these promises. So Abdullah was furious, and he starts listening to embassies that are coming from the Dutch and the French. They're offering, well, we'll give you troops and we'll get rid of the British for you, and then we'll have Penang. So he was listening to these And he was also listening to other sultans who were saying, we'll give you help. And he was so sure that he would be able to get a great army together to fight the British that he actually started to build a fort at Prai on the mainland, Seberang Prai now. And of course, this is the point when the British will act. Light writes to Calcutta and says they're going to attack us. So the British now send warships and lots of soldiers, because now they're defending their own property, or what they claim to be their own property. And of course, there's a standoff, some shots are fired. There is relatively small confrontation because Abdullah knows he cannot fight them lightly. He hasn't got those Dutch, French, or other states' forces yet, and he just surrenders. The British offer him 6,000 Spanish dollars a year, and he has to accept that. It's a very scurrilous kind of episode, I know, and it's the one really black mark, I think, on Light's career, that he did cheat Sultan Abdullah in the end. But strangely enough, it was only a few years later, Sultan Abdullah was visiting Penang often. Interestingly enough, the civil war kind of dissipated at this point. It's like as if they saw this new island and the promise that it had, and people started opening up to the idea, and suddenly the crisis was averted. So that all fell away, and things just went on, and we know what happened, of course, then. So Abdullah often visited. He had a house built for him actually on the island. So eventually they became they tolerated the situation. But Penang was such a success, of course, that everybody benefited. As we know, by 1800, Prai itself became part of the British settlement as Province Wellesley. Can we have the next slide? Thank you. So what happened then under Light? Well, he became the first superintendent. He wasn't a governor. The position of governor the name of governor wasn't used till the Raffles period, really. The main settlement was Georgetown, and they'd set up a free port. And that was wholly different from Malacca. So it just sucked all the trade out of Malacca. And even in 1786, the year in which the port began, when it was still very fledgling, and it was already August, 85 ships arrived there, which is quite a lot. By 1800, you have got over 3,500 ships arriving per annum. And James Scott and Light became very, very wealthy businessmen. James Scott had an idea that not only should there be a port, but they should also be supplying goods. Much of the trade, of course, was about spices, and spices came from very far in the archipelago. Why not plant them here in Penang? Everything will grow here. So he cleared vast areas of land for nutmeg plantations and so on and so forth. And so not only were they making money from trade, a bulk of their wealth came from their landholding and their spice plantations. James Scott and William Fairley ran the business. William Fairley was Light's Calcutta partner, and Light did something quite unusual, actually, and very unusual in the East India Company, because he actually stepped down from his position as a trader because he said it was a conflict of interest, and he was there to run the administration, which is quite an unusual thing for somebody in the East India Company, because normally that was exactly why they wanted to be governor, so that they would actually be able to make more money. So that just shows there was some kind of integrity in Light's character, that he didn't want to be busying himself with the trade whilst he was governing. But on the other hand, of course, he was benefiting from the trade, so he made a lot of money. Next slide, please. Next slide. I think we're still stuck on this slide. Yes, thank you. So the Penang grew. The main, obviously there was the fort, and then the main living area was Beach Street, Penang Street. By about 1792, there were 10,000 people living there. There were 250 bungalows alone, never mind all the atap houses and kampong houses and villages around about. There were lush plantations, and Light and Scott now were, I suppose, almost millionaires if you think in terms of the day. The whole island trade was valued at 182,000. They owned 123,000. That's a phenomenal amount. to own. Scott was the main landowner, and he owned all the godowns and all the land. Anyone settling bought land off him. Light built several homes, as we know. He lived in Georgetown, but he also had a retreat on Strawberry Hill and the famous Suffolk house, which was completed in 1792, the first version of it. Can we move on? But Light didn't live long to enjoy it. In 1791, he had a late son, Francis. In 1792, Suffolk House was completed, and he sent his older son, William. When I say older son, William was only 6 when he was sent off to England for education. He was sent to Suffolk to his old friend, school friend, George Doughty, and a letter was sent actually at that time to George Doughty with some money, £2,000, I think it was, saying, would George look for a good estate? Because I'm thinking of coming back. I think I've made my pile, made my money. The climate here is beginning to take its toll on me. And I'd like to build an estate of my own. And so that was obviously Light's plan. I'm not quite sure how that would have, how Martina would have dealt with that. But in 1793, there was a threat of war with France. It didn't actually break out, but there was a threat of war with France. Well, it did break out, but it didn't happen there. And Light said he wouldn't go home then. He would stay on to fortify Penang. It was only a wooden fort at that point, and he began to put up a stone fort. And whilst that was happening, he caught malaria. He'd had malaria before, and malaria is often like that. You can get it many times, and then eventually you can't throw off the final bout. Penang was a real malarial hotspot. Raffles himself suffered badly whilst he was there. And in 1794, Light, obviously weakened by other attacks of it in the past, passed away at the age of only 54, with so much left unaccomplished. Can we move to the next slide? What happened to Martina and the family? Well, in the will, she's left everything. None of it came to her. It's a very, very sad ending to the story, that she was clearly cheated, definitely by William Fairley, who's pictured there with his family, possibly also by James Scott, who at the very least didn't do very much to help her. But in 1799, Fairley claimed there was no money left, the companies were bankrupt. Strangely enough, that portrait was painted in 1802 and it cost £25,000. It seems highly unlikely he was bankrupt. Presumably they just formed new companies and drained all the cash out of it. Martina was a doughty lady. She wasn't going to accept that. She went to court twice against the British government and twice won her case, but still nothing came her way. All she ever received was the house she lived in, not Suffolk House, but the other house they had, and a government pension. She eventually married a British gentleman, John Timmers, and had a second family. One of her daughters, who married a British major in Calcutta, and they visited the island some years later. The major wrote that he was shocked. He couldn't believe this perfect pearl of an island, and so rich, and their family had once owned everything, and not one single penny was ever received by the children. Luckily for William, George Doughty, Light's friend, took his upbringing on him, very much like William Negus had brought Francis himself, and he was found an army commission, and that's another story, which maybe I will be telling in one of my later books. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. So that's Light. That's Light from the point of view of the Straits and his impact on the Straits and his connections in the Straits and what we learn about his life and times. It's up to you, of course, to say whether he was a bad guy or a good guy. Personally, I think he was, warts and all, he was no better than he ought to have been. He had to be a ruthless, shrewd, even mendacious person to survive in that world. But there's enough we know about him to know that he was a good friend. People who wrote about him said he was an affable, charming man. He was loyal to many people. He was loyal to Lady Chan. He was loyal to Sultan Muhammad Jiwa. I think we have to realize that most people are very well-rounded characters and they show different aspects of themselves. But this was a vital moment in the Straits story, because Penang was a little gold mine, and it wasn't just a gold mine for the British. Many fortunes were made for those many, many migrants who then came to settle in the island. And you only have to walk around Penang today to know what an amazing settlement it was. And yes, it did change the future of the Straits. Cancel culture, I hope not. I hope that we open that and look at it, because everything that happened at that period is still playing out in the world today. In my book, I'm telling this story, but my real interest is really in certain themes like migration and mixed heritage and the wonderful women of the Straits. I want to point out to people that the women in the Straits, for example, in the 18th century, were enormously more engaged in the communities than their counterparts in Britain were at the same time. It's not just a matter of mixed heritage in the terms of East meets West mixed heritage, but there's so much mixed heritage amongst the people of the Straits. And this is a really rich period for seeing, you know, how that worked and how people work together. It's always an uneasy symbiosis, but it sort of works. And the British, of course, are going to really put strains on that situation. And we're still dealing with the challenges of that now. So yes, I think we should be looking at this. And I'm hoping that my book brings it to modern Malaysia, to look back at that time, to maybe review themselves. And this is everybody's story. It's not the British story. It's not the Sultan's story. It's everybody's story. And perhaps we can, by shining a light outside of the modern world, find a few strategies for dealing with what's going on and the challenges we have in our societies today. So that's my talk. Thank you very much for listening. I think I've probably gone over the time allowed, but I'll hand over to Zoe now.
Hello, everybody again. That was a fantastic presentation, even if I do say so myself, Mum. So it's now on to the bit where you can interact with us. But before we go on to the questions and answers, I'm going to tell you a little bit about where to get the book. So if you look in the chat now, you will see millions of links. These are the links where you can purchase the book depending on where you are zooming in from today. So you can buy, if you're here in Malaysia, from MPH and Kinokuniya. But we'd just like to make a little note. Due to COVID, there has been a slight delay in the dispatch of the books coming into Malaysia. So at the moment, even you can pre-order the books in MPH and Kinokuniya, but the kind of date of the 1st of November means that they are not actually available. They'll be available in about 2 weeks. And to kind of say sorry, MPH, for this delay, because they were stuck in the port for 2 weeks longer than they had anticipated, MPH are offering a 20% discount. So if you are interested in getting the book, which I really hope you are now that you've listened to Rose's presentation, click on the first link, which is the MPH link, and take advantage of that 20% discount right now. You will be pre-ordering that book, and as soon as it becomes available on the shelves, which should be about a week's time, 2 weeks time, it will be dispatched straight to you. And if you're somewhere else like Singapore, you can look at Kinokuniya, Singapore website, it's available there. If you're in Indonesia, there's Prairie Plus. If you're in Australia, there's Dimex. If you're zooming in from the UK or worldwide, because Book Depository is a worldwide bookstore, online bookstore, you can look at that link. There's also Waterstones, which is based in the UK. And if you're in the US, there's Barnes and Noble. And worldwide, Amazon.com has also got the book available too. You can also download the book on most of the ebook platforms, such as Kindle, and that will get to you immediately. So if you have a Kindle or something like that, do it now. You'll be able to read it straight after we finish the Q&A. And if you're excited to look at what the book looks like, you can see it right there. I have a copy. I was lucky enough to get one in advance. I have pre-ordered it for all of my friends and families' birthday and Christmas presents this year. So just if any friends and family are out there, that's what's coming to you. So I'm just going to take a minute and let Rose talk a little bit about the book while I pull together some of the questions. Over to you, Rose, for a second.
Thank you for that advertisement. There are 3 books that I have written. First one, Dragon, is out now, and it's important to mention that it takes me 3 books to tell the story of light that I've just told you in the last hour. The first book, Dragon, is actually devoted to the early years of light, how he comes over to the East and what happens in his time as a country ship captain. Martina Rozel's only just enters the story towards the end. So if you're waiting for Martina, and I'm sure you are, because she was the person who drew me into this in the first place, you will only see her as a young girl. But there are many women in the story of quite note, not like Lady Chan, and many, many characters that I've mentioned this evening. The second book, Pearl, and I'm wearing my pearls tonight in honor of it, is about the actual settlement of Penang. It takes us through to those isles, and Martina is center stage right through that. The third book, Emporium, will be about the early settlement of Penang and Martina and the family and what happens to them. So that's just another outline about that. I have spent a lot of time on this book. I didn't begin by thinking I would write a book. I began because I was fascinated by Martina Rozel's about 20 years ago. And I'm a historian anyway, so as a hobby really, I started reading and researching and then doing other things, then coming back to it and doing other things. And about 5 years ago, I got quite frustrated because I'd really felt that I could write a biography of Martina Rozel's, and I knew by then that we just don't know enough about it. It wasn't possible. So then I got this idea to write a novel, and I really didn't know that it was possible. And I carried on with my research, and then after about another year, I thought I really have to start writing now, because if I don't start writing, this will just be, just a project that goes on and on forever. And then it seemed to work. So that was how I came back to write it.
That's fantastic, Rose.
So are we ready to take some questions?
I'm going to stop you there because we have 7 questions. 6.
Sorry, better get on with them then.
6 in our Q&A and 1 in our chat box. So don't worry, I haven't missed that one, Sue Kim. So I'm going to start from the first to the last, and hopefully we'll get through as many as possible. But the first one from Andrea is a really great segue from what you were just talking about then in terms of writing the book. And Andrea is asking, obviously there's a lot of research done to write Penang Chronicles, but she would really like to know, and so would I, what was the most difficult thing about writing the book? That's the first part of the question. And what was the most enjoyable? That's a really fantastic question, Andrea. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's great.
Rose, what's the most difficult and what's the most enjoyable? Over to you.
Well, I can start with the enjoyable one first. I really, really like dialogue. And as you know, I love talking. I like dialogue, and I found it a really enjoyable challenge to make dialogue that was vivid and rich, but yet still keep it within the language used at the time. I read a lot generally, but I read a lot of historical novels, and I don't quite like the sort of grandiose way sometimes people write when they're voicing the past, because you have to remember that at the time that was the modern language, that was the hip way of talking of the day. So if you make it too formal to our ears, we don't kind of get the richness of the way people were interacting with each other. So I really loved finding a kind of language I could use that both was true to the language of the day, but also to the spirit of the vitality of people who were the modern times to themselves. What I found most difficult as a writer, well, I don't think I'm a natural, I have a natural affinity for description, and yet I think it's a very, very important part of any literary work. When I'm reading other people's work, I stop and read certain passages over and over again. I'm thinking, like, how did they manage to capture something so it smells and looks and tastes and feels like I'm really there? I spent a lot of time on that, and I don't know how successfully I did, but I do find that harder. But because I find it harder, over the last few years, whenever I've seen a sunset or whenever I've tasted something particularly nice, I've actually written down my immediate feelings. What words would I use to describe this, and made it an exercise in putting myself in places. But I have to hold my hands up. I don't think I'm some authors are naturally poetic in their language, but I'm much more of an action sort of person, or a politician, or a dialogue person than a poet. So let's see what you think about that, those of you going to read it.
Thanks, Rose. That's really for many of the audience, I think, or many of us really, there's that famous quote, we all have one good book in us, and some of your responses there really resonate to how to go about getting that one book out. So anybody budding writers in the audience, take note here, because there are easy bits, there are hard bits. That's the same way in all parts of life, but the most important thing is, if you think you have a book in you, just get on with it, get it out there. The world needs
time like the present.
Exactly. So we now have a couple of questions from Meng Lam, and these are talking about kind of political colonial questions. So the first question was the English East India Company acting as a proxy for the British government in Southeast Asia? So they would like to know.
Oh, definitely. It's a very complex relationship. The East India Company is, of course, a private company run by merchants, but by this period, it's absolutely integrated into the British government. And some might say it controlled the British government, not the other way around. It was very, very powerful because of its total control of all the economies. I mean, the very fact that they could, the armies that the East India Company had were British army. The government sent British soldiers out to fight for the East India Company, and the East India Company decided where they fought. So yes, it's definitely a proxy, but also there are times when they were actually dominating political decision making. The London directors had an inordinate amount of power, and you must realise, of course, that it was a fairly corrupt and venal group of men running it. So it isn't a pleasant story, the story of the East India Company, and that I could go on for hours about some of the stuff they get up to. And Warren Hastings is a victim of them, really, because he actually was brought down by his own company more than anything else, because he was trying to make them stick to the rules, and they wouldn't do it. So yes, they are very, very integrated with the British. I mean, it's not until 100 years later that just less than 100 years later that the British government take over the colonial rule. Until then, it is the East India Company, and it's really all about China and how they can get their China trade.
Wow, there are so many kind of links from the past that reach into the future. There's a lot to be said of that time that is reflected in this time now. Meng Lam also goes on to ask a question about some facts that they've recently kind of become aware of, and they say that they've read recently in an article in the Star that it says the Sultan of Kedah had no right to offer Penang to Light because Penang was still under the control of Siam. Apparently, Siamese records of the time claim that Penang was still under their control at that time. Who is correct, Rose? Do you know from your research?
Well, the problem is when we make statements like that, we are judging nations by a modern standard. I don't think people at the time regarded nations in quite the same way. I know for a fact that, for example, where in Europe a nation means an area of land bounded by a border, in the Straits, a sultan ruled people who would happen to live in a certain place and follow a certain adat and language and religion. And the same thing for Siam. Borders were very, very vague. And just like Phuket had been backwards and forwards from Siam to Kedah to the Bugis. So all of the areas around here were, everybody claimed them. And you're absolutely right, of course, that all of Kedah technically is a vassal of Siam. But on the other hand, that was even viewed differently. The Bunga Mas that was sent to Siam by the Sultan of Kedah. The Sultan of Kedah said it was a gift. The King of Siam says it's a tribute. Everybody has sort of their own way of viewing it. So to try and put hard fast as to who owned what is kind of meaningless. Who owns it is who's there at that particular time. And it wasn't Siam at that particular time, but yeah, legally, nobody could see it anywhere, you know, but it's just not the way things operate then. And we are trying to judge it with our modern sense of, you know, nationhood and laws and to an area that was still very amorphous, really. So yes, you could view it from either way. And I'm very sure that Thais would view it that way. And I'm very sure the same way Malays claim Phuket. You know, Malays say that it was always a Malay island because Malay was the most spoken language. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not saying the star's wrong. It's not wrong. These are all credible comments to make, but there really is, it's just so vague that we can't really judge it by modern standards.
That's a great point about not judging the past on modern standards. I think, you know, it's very difficult not to do that, judge anything from your own perspective, but we really have to keep reminding ourselves that's not necessarily going to give us an insight into the past in the way that we want it to. I'm going to move on to the next questions because we've got another one just come in and really try to get through as many as we can in the next 5 minutes. Philip is asking, Rose, do you think Light's motives were purely pecuniary, or did he really have East India Company's interest at heart? And did the British government back in London have no say in this? Furthermore, did the loss of the American colonies have an influence on British trading in Southeast Asia?
There's so much there, you know. I'm probably going to forget something if you don't remind me of them. But in terms of, well, I wouldn't say Light was particularly a fan of the East India Company, not from the way his career had developed. In fact, I think he's out for himself first and foremost, and I think that most traders are. He is very keen, though, to be accepted at the table with the East India Company, and I do think his illegitimacy is a bit of a monkey on his shoulder, that he really wants people to take him seriously. So I think he does want to be part of the East India Company, but I don't think he holds a great deal of respect for them, and I certainly don't think he's in their pocket in any way. Sorry, what came after that? Can you give me the second half of that question?
The second half of the question was asking, did the British government back in London have any say in kind of the movings and the decision making of the East India Company? How far did their tendrils reach?
Yeah, I mean, you did mention something. You said about the American colonies. Yeah, I think they do. Of course they do. And but the East India Company is ruled by the London directors, and it's their decisions that count. And you know, they had a hand even in you know, choosing who was prime minister. You know, they are controlling, because as economics moves everything. So I do think the British government are very involved, but I think at this point the East India Company, when they say something, the British government will accept it. It's more the other way around. As for the American colonies, it's a brilliant comment to make, because you're absolutely right. The loss of the American colonies, everything, this is what I'm saying, the late 18th century is just so key. Everything happens at that time. The loss of the American colonies, the French Revolution, all these things that are going on in the rest of the world. Britain loses a massive area of its commercial wealth when they lose the colonies. And of course, that only strengthens the case for the East India Company are their only, you know, markets now. So people like Light actually are quite pleased when America's fall, I would imagine, because they know that all the commodity now is from their part of the world, and they can, therefore the prices will go up and it will benefit them. So I think that the other things that happened, the world was very global, and people tend to think, oh, it's only global now, but you know, all these global events are impacting massively on the Straits. And yes, I think it's a very shrewd thing to realize the loss of the American colonies play a very big part. In fact, Cornwallis, who's about to come over as the new Governor General, he's actually been the general in the Americas. That's how linked they were. And now he's being pulled out of the Americas and sent over to the East India Company. So yes, very much so.
Thanks, Rose. So we've got two questions now from Hong Hua. And the first is about Francis's family and his children, and Martina Rosel's his wife. It's a question that talks about a little bit related to what you mentioned towards the end of your presentation about Martina and the kind of inheritance that she had to fight for, or maybe, you know, did or didn't get. But also talks about how her children could have been taken away from her and sent to the UK to be brought up as British there, and without parental support and very little say from Martina whether or not that's something she wanted. You know, can you comment on I mean, it does link in some ways to some of the things that are happening in politics at the moment about citizenship and women's rights to pass on dignity and things like that.
Right.
You know, how is that part of your story and that part of Martina's story and Light's kind of children's story? How does that link with potential?
Well, I do know that apart from the fact that William was sent back to school, Light's daughters, he had 3 daughters, 2 of them are placed in school in Calcutta. In fact, one of his trips to see Warren Hastings, he's actually putting the girls in school in Calcutta. And they spent the rest of the time, obviously they did visit, and Martina and Light did visit Calcutta regularly to see them. But they were immediately put into an environment that would raise them as British girls, not as ladies of the Straits. And William, of course, was in being brought up as a British gentleman. And I don't know how much Martina had a say in that, but I do know she travelled there. It's known that she did visit. I think it must have been a very, very difficult decision for her to make in terms of her daughters. I'm not so much whether it would have been difficult in terms of her son, although she would have missed him terribly, a little boy going away like that. Because in the world she grew up with, for example, in Siam, the boys were sent to the monastery at quite young ages for education. So it's not something she doesn't kind of understand. But we can only surmise whether it was with her blessing or not. Her daughters do come back to see her. Her son, particularly her youngest son, is with her a lot of her life. I don't imagine she was happy about it, but I think she accepted that it was very important that the children were raised, at least would be recognised within the British. And by the late 1780s, the British have become very particular about the heritage of their East India Company families. In fact, they were beginning to discriminate against children of mixed races. In an earlier time, that hadn't been the case. It was absolutely important that the children exhibited British culture and lifestyle and spoke as British and so on. So I think they would have been very sensitized to being that. Otherwise, it could have been very, very difficult for them in their later life. That's a whole different, obviously, so I don't want to go into all that, but I do think it's a very interesting question, and we really don't know how much she say she had in that, but Light was obviously definite that they were going to be brought up as British.
And I think we may have actually run out of time there's 2 more questions. I think one of them you've answered from Sue Kim that was in the chat. And I think the last one, we don't have time to cover that. But what I would like to do is just read out a very small comment from one of our participants, Dini Nordin, which I think really, really is a fantastic, very articulate comment on storytelling. So I'm just going to read a little bit of what she's put in this in the chat here. And she's saying that, well, first of all, she thanks you, Rose, for the wonderful presentation of the period in Malay Archipelago. And she's learned a lot, which aligns with a lot of her own studies and research. But she wants to say her take as a young adult of Malaysia is that history has multiple points of view, and all events are a sort of a butterfly effect from one event to another all over the world. And maybe, and I think this is so pertinent to your perspective and why you wrote these series of books, maybe what we need is just more retelling of stories from different perspectives. Thank you very much, Dinny. That's just so articulate and a lovely way to end our Q&A.
Thank you very much indeed.
I'd like to just pause there to see if Rose wants to say anything more before we hand over to our wonderful host today. Rose, is there any last words that you'd like to
Just
say?
many thanks for all of you for putting up with this long session and for your interest and your questions. And I wish I could go on even longer to talk to all of you. And maybe in the future we can have another live session when everything's back to normal, perhaps in Badan, Warisan, when I could meet with you all and we could really sit down and talk about some of these things, because it's an absolute privilege to hear from you all. Thank you very much indeed.
Back to you, Wei Ling. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Rose, for such a captivating insight to the life of Francis Light and for illuminating the connections and backgrounds of many key influential characters from that era, from Suffolk to India, across Southeast Asia, and in Penang. This man had many thrilling adventures and intriguing experiences. I found that the details of his life, career, his associates, his partner Martina, their family, as well as Lady Chan, very interesting and revealing, some inspiring, some tragic. The vivid details of the historical background and geopolitics of the region at the time are fascinating too. I'm looking forward to finish reading my advanced copy of your first book in this trilogy, Rose. Many thanks for your presentation. On behalf of Badan Warisan Malaysia, we would like to warmly thank Zoe for being our amazing moderator today. I would also like to thank our operations team, Mira and Rosmiza, for helping in organizing this event. Last but not least, a big thank you to our audience from around the world for participating and listening in today. Please support Badan Warisan Malaysia on our social media. You can follow us on our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Badan Warisan Malaysia does not receive funds from the government, and we rely on donations to bring you events such as our talk series. If you have enjoyed today's talk, please donate, and the details are provided on this slide. The recording of this talk will be available soon. Please look out for an announcement and the link in our social media. Thank you, everybody, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Bye.